In June of 1876, George Armstrong Custer and his men were killed in the Montana Territory. For a century, dime novels and paintings sold the public a specific story: a valiant commander making a tragic, heroic final stand against a savage horde. But to understand what actually happened here, during what the Lakota called the Moon of Making Fat, we have to look past the mythology and ground ourselves in the physical reality of the Great Plains. Along the banks of the Little Bighorn River, thousands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho families had come together. It was the largest gathering of native peoples on the Northern Plains in history. There were around 8,000 people in this camp, including up to 5,000 warriors, and a grazing herd of 20,000 horses. The U.S. military intelligence completely missed this massive scale. General Alfred Terry and his officers assumed they would be hunting down a small group of at most 800 hostile fighters who would immediately scatter at the first sign of cavalry. Because of that severe miscalculation, the 7th Cavalry marched straight toward a massive, unified defensive alliance, entirely blind to the reality waiting in the valley. The tribes were anchored by the Hunkpapa Lakota leader, Sitting Bull. He was a highly influential political chief, but his real authority came from his role as a spiritual guide who saw the impending conflict clearly. During a recent Sundance, a deeply sacred ceremony of fasting and prayer, Sitting Bull received a vivid vision. He saw hundreds of U.S. soldiers falling upside down into the native camp, like grasshoppers dropping from the sky. A voice told him the soldiers would be defeated because, quote, they have no ears. To the tribes, this meant the American military and government consistently refused to listen to past treaties or respect the borders they had agreed to draw. So while the 7th Cavalry rode in expecting a routine pacification sweep, the indigenous defenders were spiritually and psychologically galvanized. They knew a fight was coming, and they believed their victory was already written. The assault began on the southern edge of the massive camp. Major Marcus Reno led a surprise attack, charging 3 companies of cavalry down the valley, expecting the village to panic. Instead of fleeing, the village erupted. Warriors swarmed the advancing troops, and women and older men immediately took up arms to defend their homes and herd the thousands of horses to safety. The environment immediately turned against the soldiers. It was over 90 degrees, and blinding dust kicked up by hooves mixed with thick gunpowder smoke. The cavalrymen were rapidly blinded and disoriented in the haze. Outnumbered and terrified, Reno ordered a desperate retreat into a stand of timber along the river. Command structures dissolved as soldiers scrambled for their lives. This complete collapse of military discipline shatters the folklore of an orderly cavalry. The native defenders used their sheer numbers and rapid coordination to decisively crush the first wave of the attack. Miles away, General Custer veered right toward the northern ridges with 5 companies of men. He had no idea Reno's attack had already failed. From an overlook, his own Crow and Arikara scouts had explicitly warned him about the immense size of the village. They told him there were more native fighters than the military had bullets. He ignored them. The steep topography of the Little Bighorn Ridges acted as natural funnels. Deep coulees forced Custer's troops to break into isolated pockets. Native warriors exploited these bottlenecks, surging up the ravines to completely surround the fragmented cavalry. The fighting devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat. The soldiers, cut off from their pack train, quickly burned through their ammunition. Just as Sitting Bull had seen in his vision, the troopers fell headfirst in the dust before the Lakota and Cheyenne. According to Cheyenne oral history, after the fighting ceased, 2 southern Cheyenne women found Custer's body. They pushed the point of a sewing awl deep into his ears to, quote, improve his hearing. He hadn't listened to the treaties and hadn't listened to his scouts. There was no glorious final stand. Custer's command was systematically dismantled by a combination of extreme military arrogance, environmental entrapment, and a highly motivated indigenous defense. When the guns finally stopped, an eerie, heavy silence settled over the valley. By the next evening, the massive village packed up its teepees and began moving south into the mountains. For the young warriors who had defended their families, there was intense relief and celebration. But the tribal elders were quiet. They possessed a grim understanding of what this victory actually meant. They recognized this was a Pyrrhic victory, a success that comes at such a devastating cost it ultimately leads to defeat. By wiping out Custer's command, they had painted an inescapable target on the back of every native person on the plains. They had executed a brilliant, justified defense of their homes. But that triumph was immediately overshadowed by the certainty of retaliation from an industrial superpower. News of the disaster reached the East Coast just as the United States was celebrating its 1876 centennial. The shock of losing a famous commander on the nation's 100th birthday fueled an immediate demand for vengeance. The military's approach shifted overnight. Commanders like General Phil Sheridan were given the resources to implement ruthless total war winter tactics. They attacked native camps in the freezing cold when families were most vulnerable, systematically destroying their food supplies and shelters. Following the troops came the full weight of American industry. Railroads and telegraph wires systematically carved up the prairie. Forts were constructed to enforce borders, fencing in the land and methodically dismantling the free, nomadic way of life. The Battle of the Little Bighorn remains a masterful defense of indigenous sovereignty. Yet, in destroying Custer's command, they triggered the precise military and industrial retaliation that brought the era of the Free Plains tribes to a close.